Let me tell you something that no one's saying out loud. India just walked away from America. Yeah, you heard that right. This isn't just about trade. This is a micro-drop moment in world history. Because when a rising superpower decides to stop playing by someone else's rules, that's not rebellion. That's revolution. And before you jump to conclusions, no, this isn't about hate or hostility or some overnight decision made in anger. This is about decades of quiet disrespect of deals that benefited one side while the other swallowed the cost. And now India's done swallowing, so buckle up because we're going to break this down point by point. And by the end of this, you'll realize this isn't India walking away. This is India standing up. This is not some viral news headline. This is not some emotional nationalism. This is fact, logic, data, history, and power. And I'm going to walk you through exactly why India made this move, what triggered it, and how this changes everything. Not just for India, not just for America, but for the entire global economy. Let's start with the first truth that people avoid. 1. The ticking time bomb. Trade was never equal. Let's get one thing straight. This trade fallout between India and America didn't just happen overnight. It's been building for the unequal trade equation decades, quietly, silently, under the radar, and no one talked about it because it was too uncomfortable. But here's the real truth. This trade relationship was never equal to begin with. Sure, on the surface, both countries seem to benefit. But when you peel back the layers, what you find is a system that kept India stuck in the role of supplier, cheap labor, raw materials, low-margin exports. While the U.S. dominated with high-end technology, pharmaceuticals, and defense equipment, it was never a level playing field. America exported iPhones and fighter jets. India exported cotton and generic medicine. This wasn't a partnership. It was a hierarchy, and India stayed in that role for years because it had no choice. It was still growing, still stabilizing, still recovering from colonial damage and economic dependence. But something shifted over the last 15 years. India started rising not just in GDP, but in global influence, digital capability, manufacturing power, and strategic thinking. And as India grew, the imbalance became harder to ignore. Every trade negotiation, every tariff-free discussion, every WTO dispute started to feel like a tug-of-war. One side pulling with muscle, the other trying to hold its ground. India realized it wasn't getting a fair deal. Its industries were undercut, its markets flooded, its farmers squeezed. And when it pushed back asking for tariffs, subsidies, or protection, it faced resistance from the very partner, the myth of free trade, claiming to support free and fair trade. That contradiction, that's what opened India's eyes. This wasn't mutual growth. This was quiet exploitation dressed up in diplomacy. And finally, India decided we're done playing that game. Let's talk about this idea of free trade. Sounds great, right? Open markets, fair competition, mutual growth. But here's the catch. It was never really free. At least not for India. What looked like open doors were actually carefully designed frameworks that gave developed nations, especially the US, a permanent advantage. When India signed on to trade agreements under global platforms like the WTO, it walked into a system that was already tilted. The rules were written in boardrooms far away from Indian soil by people who never had to think about Indian farmers, small manufacturers, or rural workers. Every time India to protect its domestic industries, whether it was through import tariffs, subsidies for farmers, or restrictions on foreign companies dominating key sectors, it was met with pushback, legal threats, diplomatic pressure, and media narratives followed. Protectionism, they called it. But when the US subsidized its own agriculture, tech, or oil that was called national interest, you see the double standard. India was told to play by the rules, even when those rules choked its growth. It couldn't prioritize its people without being labeled anti-global. But the truth is this so-called free trade came with invisible handcuffs. India's strategic sovereignty, every decision had to pass a Western approval filter. That's not trade, that's control, and over time the cost of that control became too high. India's farmers protested, its industry stagnated, and its growth potential was capped, all because of deals it couldn't rewrite. Eventually, India had to ask the hard question, is free trade really worth it if the price is our sovereignty? The answer became clear, not anymore. There comes a point in every nation's journey when it stops asking for validation and starts acting with vision. That's exactly where India stands today. This is no longer a country waiting in the wings, hoping for a seat at someone else's table. This is a nation building its own table with its own rules on its own terms. For decades, India was labeled developing, emerging, potential power. Always the promise, never the arrival. It was respected, yes, valued, sure, but never truly treated as equal. The West often saw India through the lens of aid, dependency, and diplomacy layered in subtle condescension. It was always rising, but never quite resent. But that perception is outdated. That story is over because the India you see today isn't just growing. It's transforming economically, digitally, militarily, strategically. India is now the world's fifth largest economy and on track to become third. It has a startup ecosystem that's one of the fastest growing on the planet. Its space missions are challenging global giants. Its digital public infrastructure like UPI and OAR is being studied and copied by the world. This isn't just progress. Trade as a weapon, the final straw, this is quiet domination, and it's happening on India's terms. Strategic sovereignty isn't just about waving a flag or making loud declarations. It's about control over resources, over decisions, over future outcomes. It's about refusing to be dragged into someone else's game just because they wrote the old rules. It means choosing your own alliances, protecting your own industries, and setting your own national priorities without waiting for permission. India doesn't want to be anyone's pawn in the global chessboard, not America's, not China's, not Europe's. For too long, it had to walk that tightrope balancing between influence and independence, between need and negotiation. But now India is breaking free from that mindset because the truth is dependence economic. Technological or military is vulnerability, and India refuses to be vulnerable anymore. Every strong relationship has a breaking point, a moment when one side pushes just a little too far. For India, that moment came when trade stopped being about economics and started becoming a tool of pressure. The US, knowingly or not, began to weaponize trade, whether it was placing India on a priority watch list for intellectual property, delaying defense tech transfers, or imposing restrictions on semiconductor and AI technology exports. The message was loud and clear: cooperate on our terms or face consequences. India saw this happening in real time. It was no longer about negotiations, it was about conditions. The US began using access to critical technologies as leverage. Want that drone tech? Agree to our strategic demands. Want semiconductor support? Shift your alliances. This wasn't partnership, it was coercion. India's global pivot, new markets, new allies, which has always balanced its foreign policy with a focus on autonomy, felt that pressure closing in. Then came the red lines when India refused to take sides in geopolitical conflicts, or when it continued energy deals with nations under Western sanctions. The retaliation started through trade restrictions, delays, silent punishments, and India realized this wasn't sustainable. It couldn't build its future around a partner willing to turn off the tap the moment New Delhi made an independent decision. This wasn't paranoia, it was reality. Other nations had faced the same treatment. Economic bullying masters diplomacy. India watched, learned, and drew a line in the sand. The final straw wasn't a tariff or a policy, it was the realization that dependency is vulnerability. And India, a nation built on resilience, refuses to be vulnerable. That's why it started pulling back quietly, strategically, because trade should be a bridge, not a leash. When India decided to walk away from its trade dependency on America, it didn't do so blindly. This wasn't a reckless exit. It was a well-calculated shift. The idea that India would suffer without U.S. trade ties is outdated thinking. Today's India has options, and it's using them. In fact, instead of shrinking, India's global trade footprint is expanding, just not through the usual Western pipelines. India has been steadily building stronger ties with BRIC nations like Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa, focusing on trade in local currencies and bypassing the dollar where possible. It's deepening connections with Southeast Asian countries through the ASEAN framework, signing new trade agreements that actually respect mutual interests. Africa, long overlooked by the West, is becoming a strategic partner for India. The bold rebirth of a superpower pharmaceuticals, infrastructure, and education exports. Even Latin America is on India's radar, offering untapped markets hungry for diversification. This diversification isn't just smart, it's powerful. It gives India bargaining power, flexibility, and the ability to absorb shocks. If one trade lane slows down, another one opens up. Unlike in the past, India isn't stuck waiting for a green signal from Washington to move forward. And let's be clear, global corporations are still investing in India. From Apple to Tesla to Google, the world sees India as the next big market. Regardless of its U.S. trade stance, supply chains are relocating here. Data centers are being built. India isn't isolating itself. It's positioning itself as the hub. The truth is India didn't cut off trade. It rerouted it away from dependency toward opportunity. And that single move is what's making nations pay attention. Because when you walk away from a superpower and still thrive, the world starts to wonder, what do you know that they don't? Most people look at India's decision to step back from USD-centered trade and think it's a rebellion. But it's not. It's a rebirth. What the West calls defiance, India calls direction. This move wasn't about ego or making headlines. It was about reclaiming control over its own future. For decades, India had been told how to grow, where to invest, and what its role in the global order should be. But now it's making its own rules, and that's the part nobody wants to talk about, because here's the uncomfortable truth. When a nation starts choosing itself over legacy deals, over outdated hierarchies, and over unequal partnerships, it disrupts the system. It threatens the comfort of those who have long benefited from the imbalance. That's exactly what India is doing, challenging the assumption that it will always play second to someone else's lead. This isn't about cutting ties. Conclusion: India's voice, India's victory, it's about cutting limits. India is no longer the junior partner in global economics. It's investing in homegrown manufacturing, pushing digital independence, and forging bilateral trade deals that reflect equality, not submission. It's standing up for its farmers, its workers, and its entrepreneurs instead of bending to global pressures that serve foreign interests first. That kind of clarity, that kind of confidence, it scares the old guard. But for India, it's liberating because for the first time in modern history, India isn't reacting to global shifts. It's creating them, and when you make moves that bold, you don't need to explain yourself. You let the results speak. India's trade pivot isn't a retreat. It's a declaration. We know who we are, what we're worth, and we're not waiting for anyone's validation anymore. So here's the truth. No one's telling you. India didn't end trade with America out of fear. It didn't walk away because it was weak. It walked away because it was finally strong enough to do so. This was not an exit. This was an evolution. India has stepped into its own power economically, diplomatically, and strategically. It's no longer asking for approval. It's setting the pace, it's writing its own rules, and that shift, it's not just final message plus like share, subscribe, historic. It's unstoppable, because when a country finds its voice after decades of being underestimated, the world doesn't know how to handle it. But India does, and it's just getting started. If this opened your eyes to the real game behind global trade, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep no breakdowns on how India is changing the world one bold move at a time. Drop a comment below. Do you think India made the right call? Let's talk about it.